Sarah Martinez had always been careful about answering the door late at night. Growing up in the small town of Millbrook, her mother had drilled this lesson into her from childhood. "Nothing good happens after midnight, Mia," her mother would say, shaking her head whenever the evening news showed another tragedy that could have been prevented with simple caution. But on the night of October 15th, 2023, something made Sarah ignore every instinct she had ever learned. Something made her walk to that front door, turn the brass handle, and step into the darkness beyond. By morning, she was gone, leaving behind only questions that would haunt her family and an entire community for months to come. Sarah was 28 years old, a kindergarten teacher, beloved by her students and their parents alike. She lived alone in a modest two-bedroom house on Elm Street, a quiet residential area where neighbors still waved to each other and children rode their bikes safely until dinner time. The house had belonged to her grandmother, passed down after the elderly woman's death 2 years earlier. Sarah had painted the shutters a cheerful yellow and planted roses in the front garden, transforming the place into something that felt truly hers. Those who knew Sarah described her as responsible, kind, and predictable in the best possible way. She attended church every Sunday, volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, and never missed a family dinner at her parents' house every Tuesday evening. Her routines were as reliable as clockwork. She woke at 6 each morning, made coffee in the same blue mug her grandmother had used, and arrived at Millbrook Elementary School 15 minutes before her shift began. On the evening, she disappeared. Sarah had followed her usual routine. She had dinner with her parents, as she did every Tuesday. Her mother, Carmen Martinez, later told police that Sarah seemed perfectly normal that night. They had talked about her upcoming parent-teacher conferences, laughed about her father's failed attempts to fix the kitchen faucet, made plans for Sarah to help with her younger brother's birthday party the following weekend. She was happy. Carmen would repeat to anyone who would listen in the days that followed. "My daughter was happy. She had no reason to leave, no reason to run away. Something terrible happened to her." Sarah left her parents' house at exactly 8:30 that evening, just as she always did. The drive home took 12 minutes, a route she had traveled thousands of times through the familiar streets of her childhood. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, saw her pull into the driveway at 8:45. She waved from her kitchen window, and Sarah waved back, another small ritual that had developed over the months since Sarah moved into her grandmother's house. What happened in the hours between 8:45 and midnight remained a mystery. That would consume the thoughts of everyone who loved Sarah. Phone records showed she had made 2 calls that evening. The first was to her best friend, Jessica Walsh, at 9:15. They talked for 23 minutes about ordinary things: Jessica's new job at the bank, a movie they wanted to see together, and Sarah's concerns about one of her students who seemed troubled. "She sounded completely normal," Jessica told investigators later. "We laughed. We made plans for the weekend. There was nothing strange about her voice, nothing that suggested she was worried or scared." The second call was even more routine. At 10:30, Sarah called her mother to ask for their grandmother's recipe for chocolate chip cookies. She wanted to make them for a class the next day as a reward for good behavior during their recent fire drill practice. Carmen walked her through the recipe, making sure Sarah wrote down the correct measurements for vanilla and baking soda. The conversation lasted 8 minutes and ended with Sarah saying she loved her mother and would talk to her tomorrow. Those were the last words anyone in Sarah's family would ever hear her speak. After the phone call, Sarah appeared to settle in for the evening. Her television was found on the next morning, tuned to the local news channel she watched every night. A cup of chamomile tea sat half-finished on the coffee table, still in the same flowered mug she had used since college. Her laptop showed she had been checking her email and browsing social media until approximately 11:40-5. But something changed in those final 15 minutes before midnight. Something drew Sarah away from her comfortable evening routine and toward the front door of her house. Security cameras from a neighbor's home across the street would later show her porch light coming on at exactly 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes later, the front door opened, and Sarah's silhouette appeared in the doorway. The camera was too far away to show details, but investigators could see Sarah step outside and appear to speak to someone. She gestured with her hands, suggesting a conversation, though no other person was visible in the frame. After roughly 3 minutes, Sarah moved further away from her house, beyond the range of the camera's view. The porch light remained on. The front door stood open, and Sarah Martinez was never seen again. When Sarah failed to show up for work the next morning, her principal, Mrs. Patterson, immediately knew something was wrong. In 3 years of teaching, Sarah had never missed a day without calling ahead. She was the teacher other staff members could count on, the one who arrived early and stayed late, the one who genuinely cared about every child in her classroom, Mrs. U. Patterson called Sarah's cell phone repeatedly, hearing only her cheerful voicemail message asking callers to leave their name and number. Growing increasingly worried, she called Sarah's emergency contact, her mother, Carmen. Carmen's heart began racing the moment she heard Mrs. Patterson's voice. A mother's intuition told her immediately that something was terribly wrong. She called her husband Roberto, who left work and met her at Sarah's house. They found the front door unlocked, hanging open, as if their daughter had stepped out for just a moment and planned to return immediately. Inside, everything appeared normal. Sarah's purse sat on the kitchen counter with her wallet, credit cards, and identification still inside. Her car keys hung on the small hook by the door where she always placed them. Her phone was charging on the nightstand beside her bed, showing dozens of missed calls and text messages from worried family members and coworkers. The only thing missing was Sarah herself. Roberto Martinez, a man who had worked in construction for 30 years and prided himself on staying calm in crisis situations, broke down in his daughter's living room. "She's gone," he whispered to his wife, the words barely audible. "Our little girl is gone." The call to 911 came at 10:47 a.m. on Wednesday morning, October 16th. Carmen Martinez's voice shook as she tried to explain to the dispatcher that her daughter was missing, that something terrible had happened during the night.
Out.
Trained to remain calm during emergencies. Asked the standard questions about when Sarah was last seen and whether she might have gone somewhere voluntarily. "You don't understand," Carmen said, her voice rising with each word. "My daughter doesn't just disappear, she calls, if she's going to be 5 minutes late. She's never missed work, never left her door open, never gone anywhere without her purse. Something is very, very wrong." Detective Mike Sullivan arrived at the scene within 30 minutes, a 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department. Sullivan had worked hundreds of missing person cases, and he knew the statistics. Most adults who disappeared had chosen to leave, whether due to personal problems, financial troubles, or relationship issues. But as he walked through Sarah's house, examining the scene with careful attention to detail, he began to suspect this case would be different. The house told a story of someone who had been settling in for a quiet evening at home. Sarah's work clothes were folded neatly on a chair in her bedroom, replaced by comfortable pajamas and a soft robe. Her laptop was still open on the coffee table, logged into her Facebook account, where she had been responding to comments on photos. From a friend's wedding, the last activity, timestamp, showed 11:43 p.m. In the kitchen, Detective Sullivan found ingredients laid out on the counter: flour, sugar, chocolate chips, and eggs. Sarah had clearly been preparing to bake the cookies she had discussed with her mother. The recipe, written in her neat handwriting on a yellow sticky note, was still attached to the refrigerator. A mixing bowl sat empty beside the ingredients, suggesting she had been interrupted before she could begin, but it was the front door that troubled Sullivan most. The deadbolt was unlocked, which Sarah's family insisted was highly unusual. Her father had installed the lock himself and had repeatedly emphasized to Sarah the importance of using it every night. More significantly, there were no signs of forced entry, no scratches around the lock, no damaged wood around the frame. Whoever had drawn Sarah outside, she had gone willingly. The security footage from the neighbors' camera became the centerpiece of the initial investigation. Detective Sullivan watched it dozens of times, analyzing every frame for clues about what might have happened in those crucial minutes after midnight. The image quality was frustrating, clear enough to see Sarah's movements, but too distant to reveal important details. Sarah appeared in the doorway at exactly midnight. wearing what looked like her robe over her pajamas. She stood there for several seconds as if listening to someone speak. Then she stepped onto the porch, gesturing with her hands in what appeared to be conversation. At one point, she turned back toward the house, as if considering going back inside, but then she moved forward again, beyond the camera's range. It's almost like she recognized whoever was out there, Sullivan told his partner, Detective Lisa Park. As they reviewed the footage together, she's not acting afraid or surprised. She's acting like she's talking to someone she knows. The investigation expanded quickly as news of Sarah's disappearance spread through Millbrook. Police officers went door to door throughout the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. They interviewed Sarah's coworkers, friends, and family members, searching for any detail that might explain why she had left her house at midnight. The interviews painted a consistent picture of Sarah as a woman without enemies or serious problems. Her principal described her as one of the most dedicated teachers in the school district. Her fellow teachers spoke of her kindness and reliability. Her students' parents praised her patience and creativity in the classroom. Even her ex-boyfriend from 2 years earlier, David Chen, had nothing but positive things to say about her character. Sarah was the best person I ever knew, David told Detective Park during his interview. We broke up because I was moving to another state for work, not because of any problems between us. She was honest, loyal, and had a good heart. I can't imagine anyone wanting to hurt her. But as the investigation deepened, small details began to emerge that suggested Sarah's life might not have been as simple as it appeared. Jessica Walsh, her best friend, mentioned during her second interview that Sarah had seemed distracted over the past few weeks. Nothing dramatic, but she had been more quiet than usual, more likely to stare off into space during their conversations. I asked her about it once, Jessica said, sitting in the police station conference room, with tissues scattered around her chair. She said she was just tired from work, that the new school year was more stressful than usual. But looking back, I wonder if something else was bothering her. Sarah's mother revealed another troubling detail. 3 weeks before her disappearance, Sarah had asked unusual questions about her grandmother's death. She wanted to know if there had been any problems with the house, any issues with neighbors or previous maintenance workers. When Carmen asked why she was concerned, Sarah had brushed off the questions, saying she was just being careful as a single woman living alone. I should have paid more attention, Carmen said, her voice heavy with guilt. I should have asked more questions, pushed her to tell me what was really bothering her. The physical search for Sarah began on Thursday morning, October 17th, 36 hours after she was last seen. Volunteers from the community joined police officers and search and rescue teams to comb through the wooded areas surrounding Millbrook. They searched along the river that ran through town, checked abandoned buildings, and walked through fields and parks where someone might have taken her. Dogs trained to track, human scent were brought in from the state police. They picked up Sarah's trail from her front porch but lost it at the end of her driveway, where it intersected with the main road. The implication was clear. Sarah had gotten into a vehicle at that point, either willingly or by force, as the search continued. Detective Sullivan received the phone records he had requested from Sarah's cell service provider. Most of the calls and texts were routine communication with family and friends. But buried in the data was something that made him pause. 3 calls from an unknown number in the week leading up to her disappearance. The calls had come at odd times. 6:23 a.m. On October 9th, 11:47 p.m. On October 12th, and 2:15 p.m. on October 14th, just 1 day before Sarah vanished. Each call had lasted less than 30 seconds, suggesting they had gone to voicemail or been answered and quickly ended. When Sullivan traced the number, he discovered it belonged to a prepaid cell phone purchased with cash at a convenience store. In the next town over, the store's security cameras had been broken for months, providing no clue about who had bought the phone. It was the kind of phone someone would use if they wanted to remain anonymous, if they had something to hide. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon when Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who had waved to Sarah on Tuesday evening, remembered something that hadn't seemed important at the time. 2 weeks earlier, she had noticed a man standing at the end of Sarah's driveway, looking at the house. When she had glanced out again a few minutes later, he was gone. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Mrs. Chen explained to Detective Sullivan. I just thought maybe he was a repair person or someone looking for directions. But he was there for several minutes, just standing and looking at the house. Mrs. Chun's description was vague. A white man of average height and build wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap that obscured his face. It wasn't much to go on. But it was the first suggestion that someone had been watching Sarah before she disappeared, as the investigation entered its fourth day. The Martinez family held their first press conference, standing on the steps of the Millbrook Police Department, with Detective Sullivan beside them. Roberto Martinez, usually a private man who avoided attention, spoke directly into the television cameras with tears in his eyes. "Someone knows what happened to our daughter," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious pain. "Sarah is a good person who never hurt anyone. She has students who need her, a family who loves her, and a whole life ahead of her. Please, if you know anything at all, help us bring her home." The tip line established by the Millbrook Police Department received over 200 calls in the first week after Sarah's disappearance. Detective Sullivan and his team worked around the clock, following up on every lead, no matter how unlikely. It seemed most calls were from well-meaning citizens who thought they had seen Sarah in grocery stores, gas stations, or walking along roads in neighboring towns. Each sighting had to be investigated and ultimately ruled out. But on Monday morning, October 21st, a call came in that changed everything. The caller was Janet Morrison, a woman who lived alone in a rural area about 15 miles from Millbrook. She had been hesitant to contact police, she explained, because she wasn't sure if what she had witnessed was connected to the missing teacher she had seen on the news. "I was up late that Tuesday night, the night she went missing," Janet told Detective Park over the phone. "My dog was sick, and I was sitting up with him by the window. Around 12:30 in the morning, I saw headlights coming down the dirt road that leads to my property. That's unusual because it's a dead-end road and I'm the only one who lives out here." Janet explained that she had watched from her darkened living room as a dark-colored SUV passed her house and continued toward the dead end about a quarter-mile away. The vehicle had its lights on but was moving slowly, as if the driver was unfamiliar with the area. About 20 minutes later, the same SUV had passed her house again, heading back toward the main road. "I thought maybe someone was lost, or teenagers were using the dead end to park and drink," Janet continued. "But then I saw the news about that poor girl, and I started wondering if maybe it was connected. The timing seems too close to be a coincidence?" Detective Sullivan drove out to Janet's property that same afternoon. The area was isolated, surrounded by dense woods and accessible only by the narrow dirt road Janet had described. At the dead end, Sullivan found what appeared to be recent tire tracks in the soft earth, though rain over the weekend had made them difficult to analyze clearly. More significantly, while walking through the wooded area beyond the road's end, Sullivan discovered something that made his heart race: a piece of light blue fabric caught on a low branch. About 50 yards into the trees, the fabric appeared to be cotton, possibly from a robe or nightgown, and it looked fresh, as if it had been torn recently. Sarah's mother confirmed that her daughter owned a light blue cotton robe, the one she typically wore during her evening routines at home. The fabric was sent to the state crime lab for analysis, but Sullivan already knew in his gut that it belonged to Sarah. The question was whether she had lost it while trying to escape from someone, or whether her attacker had brought her to this isolated location for darker purposes. The discovery prompted a massive search effort in the wooded area around Janet Morrison's property. Search and rescue teams, volunteers, and cadaver dogs combed through acres of forest, looking for any sign of Sarah or clues about what had happened to her. The terrain was challenging, filled with thick underbrush, fallen logs, and areas where heavy rain had created muddy, impassable conditions. While the physical search continued, Detective Sullivan focused on the mysterious phone calls Sarah had received before her disappearance. Working with federal agents who specialized in telecommunications investigations, he learned that the prepaid phone had been used to call only one number: Sarah's. The calls had been made from different cell towers, suggesting the caller had been moving around the area, possibly watching Sarah's routine and planning something. The timing of the calls began to form a pattern that chilled Sullivan to the bone. The first call, at 6:23 a.m. on October 9th, had come just as Sarah would have been getting ready for work. The second, at 11:47 p.m. on October 12th, was close to her usual bedtime. The third, at 2:15 p.m. on October 14th, had come during her lunch break at school. Someone had been studying her schedule, learning her habits, preparing for something. Sarah's phone records showed that she had never answered these calls. Each had gone to voicemail after several rings and no messages had been left. Sullivan wondered if the caller had been testing her response time, seeing how long it took her to notice and react to unexpected calls. The investigation took another disturbing turn when Detective Park discovered something troubling in Sarah's employment records. 3 months earlier, the school district had received a complaint about a man who had been seen hanging around the elementary school playground during recess. The complaint had come from another teacher who noticed the man taking pictures with his phone while children played. When questioned by school security, the man had claimed to be a freelance photographer working on a project about small-town life. He had provided identification showing his name as Marcus Webb, but when school officials tried to verify his credentials later, they discovered the address he had given was false. The man had left before police could be called and no further incidents had been reported. The physical description from the school incident matched what Mrs. Chen had provided about the man she had seen watching Sarah's house. White male. Average height and build, dark clothing, baseball cap pulled low over his face. It was still vague, but the connection between the school and Sarah's home was too significant to ignore. Detective Sullivan obtained the school's security footage from the day of the playground incident. The images were grainy and taken from a distance, but they showed a man who appeared to be in his 30s or 40s, with dark hair visible beneath his cap. He had been carrying a professional-looking camera and had positioned himself to have a clear view of the playground where Sarah supervised her students during their outdoor time. He wasn't just taking random pictures, Sullivan told Detective Park as they reviewed the footage together. Look at where he's standing, how he's angling the camera. He's focused on Sarah's class specifically. He was watching her, studying her interaction with the children, learning her routine. The investigation expanded to include other school districts in the region. Sullivan wanted to know if Marcus Webb, or someone matching his description, had been spotted around other schools. The response was immediate and alarming. Similar incidents had been reported at 3 other elementary schools within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook. At each location, witnesses described the same type of man behaving in the same suspicious manner. He would arrive during recess or dismissal time, position himself where he could observe teachers and students, take photographs, and then disappear before anyone could question him thoroughly. In each case, the identification he provided turned out to be false. Most disturbing of all, Detective Sullivan learned that 2 other young women in the region had received mysterious phone calls from prepaid numbers in the weeks before Sarah's disappearance. Both women were elementary school teachers, both lived alone, and both had noticed someone watching their homes or workplaces in the days leading up to the calls. Rachel Torres, a teacher in the neighboring town of Fairview, told police that she had received 4 calls from an unknown number in September. Like Sarah, she had never answered the calls, and no messages had been left. She had also noticed a man taking pictures near her classroom window during recess, but when she had gone outside to confront him, he had already left. I thought it was just some creep, Rachel said during her interview with Detective Park. I never imagined it could be connected to someone planning something like this. If I had known, if I had reported it immediately, maybe Sarah would still be safe. Emily Davis, a teacher from Riverside Elementary, reported a similar experience. She had received 3 mysterious calls in early October and had noticed a man watching her house from a parked car one evening. When she had called out to him, asking if he needed help, he had driven away quickly without responding. The pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. Someone had been systematically targeting young female elementary school teachers who lived alone. He had been studying their routines, learning their habits, and preparing for something that had culminated in Sarah's disappearance. Detective Sullivan knew he was no longer investigating a simple missing person case. He was hunting a predator. who had been planning and preparing for months. Someone who had chosen his victims carefully and had the patience to watch and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. The realization brought both hope and fear. Hope because patterns could be analyzed and predicted, giving investigators a better chance of catching the perpetrator. Fear because if this man had taken Sarah, if he had been planning this for months, the chances of finding her alive were growing smaller with each passing day as the investigation entered its second week. The Martinez family struggled to maintain hope, while facing the growing possibility that they might never see their daughter alive again. Carmen Martinez had stopped eating regularly and barely slept, spending her nights calling Sarah's phone just to hear her voicemail message. Roberto had taken leave from work and spent his days helping with the search efforts, refusing to consider the possibility that they might be looking for a body instead of a living person. "She's out there somewhere," Carmen whispered to her husband as they sat in their empty house, surrounded by photos of their missing daughter. "She's waiting for us to find her. She's waiting to come home." 2 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, the investigation received an unexpected boost from an unlikely source. Marcus Webb, the name the suspicious man had given at the elementary school, might have been false, but he had made a crucial mistake. The prepaid phone he had used to call Sarah had been purchased at a convenience store that had recently upgraded its security system, installing high-definition cameras that captured clear images of customers. Detective Sullivan spent hours reviewing footage from the store, looking for anyone who might match the description of the man seen at various schools. On October 5th, 10 days before Sarah vanished, the cameras had recorded a man purchasing a prepaid phone with cash. He was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, clearly trying to hide his identity. But the new cameras had captured enough detail to see his face. When he briefly looked up at the ceiling, the image was grainy but usable. Sullivan immediately distributed copies to law enforcement agencies throughout the region, hoping someone would recognize the face. He also released the photo to local news stations, asking the public for help in identifying the man who might have information about Sarah's disappearance. The response came within hours. Carol Henderson, a librarian in the nearby town of Oakville, called the tip line to report that she recognized the man in the photo. He had been a regular visitor too. Her library over the past several months, always using the public computers and always paying in cash for printing services. He was quiet, polite, but there was something about him that made me uncomfortable, Carol told Detective Park during their phone conversation. He would spend hours on the computers, and I noticed he was often looking at social media profiles and local news websites. He seemed particularly interested in stories about schools and teachers. Carol provided another crucial piece of information. The man had used the library's computers to create and print what appeared to be professional-looking business cards and photographer credentials. She had seen him working on documents that claimed he was a freelance photographer, specializing in community events and educational settings. Detective Sullivan drove to Oakville immediately, hoping to learn more about the mysterious man's activities. The library's computer system kept logs of user activity, and Carol was able to provide records showing which terminals the man had used and when. The pattern that emerged was disturbing and methodical. The man had visited the library almost daily for 3 months, always during different time slots, always using different computers. He had spent hours researching local schools, looking up staff directories, and browsing social media profiles of teachers throughout the region. Most chilling of all, he had repeatedly accessed online maps and satellite images of residential areas, focusing particularly on homes near elementary schools. The computer logs showed that he had researched Sarah Martinez specifically. He had viewed her school's website, found her classroom page with photos of her students' artwork, and accessed her limited social media profiles. He had also researched the history of her grandmother's house, looking up property records and previous owners. This wasn't random, Sullivan explained to Detective Park as they reviewed the evidence. He chose Sarah specifically, studied her life, her routine, her living situation. He knew she lived alone in an inherited house, knew she was close to her family, knew she cared deeply about her students. He used all of that information to plan whatever happened that night. The investigation took on new urgency as Sullivan realized they were dealing with someone who was not only dangerous, but also highly organized and patient. This was not a crime of opportunity, but rather the result of months of careful planning and preparation. Mathematize. The man had first appeared at the Oakville Library in July, 3 months before Sarah's disappearance. His early computer sessions had focused on general research about the region, local news, and public records. As weeks passed, his searches had become more specific, focusing on elementary schools and their staff members. In August, he had begun visiting schools during recess and dismissal times, using his fake photographer credentials to explain his presence if questioned. He had been systematic about his surveillance, visiting different schools on different days, always keeping detailed notes about teacher schedules and routines. September had marked an escalation in his behavior. Computer logs showed he had begun researching specific teachers who met his apparent criteria: young, single women who lived alone and worked with children. He had accessed their social media profiles, searched for their home addresses, and even looked up information about their family members and backgrounds. The pattern suggested he had been considering multiple potential victims. Before settling on Sarah, Detective Sullivan contacted the other teachers who had received mysterious phone calls, wanting to understand why Sarah had ultimately been chosen over the others. Rachel Torres from Fairview provided a crucial insight during her follow-up interview. She had recently started dating someone new, a fact she had mentioned on her social media profiles. Emily Davis from Riverside had roommates, information that was available through various online sources. Sarah, on the other hand, had been completely alone and isolated in her grandmother's house. He wanted someone vulnerable, Sullivan realized. Someone who wouldn't be immediately missed. Someone who didn't have a boyfriend or roommates who might check on her regularly. Sarah's predictable routine and isolated living situation made her the perfect target. The breakthrough in identifying the suspect came from an unexpected source: a traffic camera located on the main road leading to Janet Morrison's property. The camera had been installed 6 months earlier as part of a county initiative to monitor rural areas where illegal dumping had become a problem. Detective Sullivan had requested footage from all traffic cameras in the region for the night of Sarah's disappearance. Most had shown nothing unusual, but the rural camera had captured something significant: a dark SUV traveling toward the dead-end road. At 12:34 a.m. on October 16th, just 34 minutes after Sarah was last seen on her neighbor's security camera, the image quality was better than expected, clear enough to read the license plate number. Sullivan ran the plate through the state database and discovered it belonged to a 2019 Honda Pilot registered to someone named Thomas Mitchell in a town about 40 miles away. But when investigators visited the address associated with the registration, they found an elderly woman who had never heard of Thomas Mitchell and had never owned a Honda Pilot. Further investigation revealed that the license plate had been reported stolen 3 weeks earlier from a parking lot in the state capital. The theft had occurred during a busy weekend when thousands of people were in town for a college football game, making it nearly impossible to identify who had taken the plate. However, the traffic camera had captured something else valuable: a partial view of the vehicle's VIN number through the windshield. Vehicle identification numbers are unique to each car, and this one led investigators to a Honda Pilot that had been purchased for cash from a used car dealership 2 months earlier. The buyer had provided identification showing his name as David Thompson, but like Marcus Webb and Thomas Mitchell, this identity proved to be false when investigators tried to verify it. The address on the fake ID led to an abandoned warehouse, and the phone number was disconnected. Despite the false identity, the car dealership had security cameras that provided the clearest images yet of their suspect. The footage showed a man in his mid-30s with dark hair, medium build, and what appeared to be a small scar on his left cheek. He had been wearing different clothes than in previous surveillance footage, but the facial features were consistent with the other sightings. Detective Sullivan distributed the new photos to law enforcement agencies across the country, hoping someone would recognize the face. He also worked with FBI profilers to develop a better understanding of who they were looking for and why he had targeted Sarah specifically. The profile that emerged was deeply disturbing. The suspect was likely a man in his 30s or early 40s who had a specific fixation on elementary school teachers. He was organized, patient, and intelligent enough to use false identities and avoid detection for months. His systematic approach suggested he had either done this before or had spent considerable time planning and fantasizing about it. Most troubling of all, the profilers believed the suspect had taken Sarah to the remote location near Janet Morrison's property with a specific purpose in mind. The isolated area, the careful planning, and the evidence of Sarah being brought there against her will all suggested that her disappearance was not intended to be temporary. We need to prepare the family for the possibility that we're looking for someone who never intended to let Sarah go, the lead FBI profiler told Sullivan during a conference call. This level of planning, this degree of obsession, it's not consistent. With someone who plans to release their victim, as the investigation entered its third week, the reality of the situation began to weigh heavily on everyone involved. The Martinez family continued to hold on to hope, organizing search parties and distributing flyers with Sarah's photograph throughout the region. But investigators were increasingly focused on finding evidence of what had happened to her rather than finding her alive. The case had captured national attention, with news crews from major networks arriving in Millbrook to cover the story. Sarah's disappearance had struck a chord with people across the country, particularly parents and teachers who saw their own vulnerability reflected in her situation. But for all the media attention and investigative resources being devoted to the case, one crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Sarah Martinez, and was she still alive to be saved? 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, the investigation received its most significant break yet, but it came with devastating news. A hiker exploring a remote section of state forest, about 30 miles from where Sarah was last seen, discovered something that would change everything. A shallow grave hidden beneath fallen leaves and forest debris. The discovery was made by Jennifer Walsh, an experienced hiker who often explored the less traveled areas of the forest preserve. She had been following an old logging trail when her dog Rex became agitated and began digging frantically at a spot where the earth looked recently disturbed. What Jennifer found beneath the surface made her immediately call 911. Detective Sullivan arrived at the scene within an hour, accompanied by the state police forensics team and the medical examiner. The location was approximately 2 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking through dense forest terrain. It was the kind of place someone would choose if they wanted to ensure a body would never be found. The remains were carefully excavated over the course of several hours. The victim had been buried in a shallow grave, covered with leaves and branches, in an attempt to conceal the site. Personal items found with the body confirmed what everyone had feared. They had found Sarah Martinez, the light blue cotton robe that had been torn and left. On a branch near Janet Morrison's property was found with Sarah's body, along with the pajamas she had been wearing the night she disappeared. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested she had been dead for approximately 3 weeks. Consistent with the timeline of her disappearance, Detective Sullivan faced the terrible task of informing Sarah's family about the discovery. He drove to the Martinez home that evening, dreading the conversation he was about to have with parents who had never stopped hoping their daughter would come home alive. Carmen Martinez opened the door and immediately knew from Sullivan's expression that he brought the worst possible news. She collapsed into her husband's arms before the detective could even speak the words aloud. Roberto Martinez, a strong construction worker who had held his family together through 3 weeks of uncertainty, broke down completely when Sullivan confirmed that Sarah's body had been found. "We never stopped believing she would come home," Carmen whispered through her tears. "We never stopped hoping. How could someone do this to our little girl? How could someone take her away from us forever?" The autopsy results, completed 2 days later, provided answers that only deepened the family's grief. Sarah had died from blunt force trauma to the head, suggesting she had been struck with a heavy object. The medical examiner found no evidence of sexual assault, but there were signs that she had been restrained, with marks on her wrists and ankles consistent with rope or zip ties. Most disturbing of all, the evidence suggested that Sarah had survived for several hours after being taken from her home. She had fought for her life with defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she had tried to protect herself from her attacker. The thought that she had spent her final hours in terror, knowing she was going to die, was almost too much. For her family to bear, the discovery of Sarah's body transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a murder investigation. The FBI became fully involved, bringing additional resources and expertise to help catch Sarah's killer. The case was reclassified as a federal investigation due to the evidence suggesting the suspect had crossed state lines and potentially targeted multiple victims. Agent Rebecca Torres, a specialist in serial predator cases, was assigned to lead the federal investigation alongside Detective Sullivan. Her experience with similar cases brought a new perspective to the evidence they had gathered. This wasn't his first victim, Agent Torres told the investigative team during their first briefing together. The level of planning, the systematic approach, the way he avoided detection for so long, this indicates someone with experience. We need to expand our search to include similar cases in other states. The FBI's behavioral analysis team developed a more detailed profile of Sarah's killer based on the new evidence. The suspect was likely a man in his 30s or 40s who had a specific fixation on elementary school teachers. He was organized, methodical, and patient, capable of planning and executing complex crimes while avoiding capture. The profile suggested he probably had a background that gave him knowledge of law enforcement techniques, possibly through military service, security work, or previous encounters with the criminal justice system. His ability to create convincing false identities and avoid surveillance cameras indicated sophistication beyond that of a typical opportunistic criminal. Most concerning of all, the behavioral analysts believed Sarah's murder was not an isolated incident. The systematic nature of his stalking behavior, the careful selection of victims, and the elaborate planning suggested someone who had refined his methods through previous crimes. Agent Torres initiated a nationwide search for similar cases involving missing or murdered elementary school teachers. The results were chilling. Over the past 5 years, at least 12 young female teachers had disappeared under suspicious circumstances across 6 different states. Most had lived alone. Most had disappeared from their homes at night, and most had never been found. The cases stretched from California to Florida, suggesting a suspect who was either highly mobile or had relocated multiple times. In each case, witnesses had reported seeing a man taking photographs near schools or asking questions about specific teachers in the weeks before the disappearances. Detective Sullivan felt a mixture of vindication and horror as the pattern became clear. He had been right to suspect they were dealing with a serial predator, but the scope of the crimes was far worse than he had imagined. Sarah was not this man's first victim, and unless they caught him soon, she would not be his last. The investigation team began working with law enforcement agencies in all 6 states where similar disappearances had occurred. They shared their evidence, compared notes, and began building a comprehensive timeline of the suspect's activities over the past 5 years. The pattern that emerged showed a killer who struck approximately every 4 to 6 months, always targeting elementary school teachers who fit his specific criteria. He would spend weeks or months in each area, studying potential victims and planning his attacks before selecting one teacher and making his move. After each crime, he would disappear completely, sometimes for months at a time before surfacing in a new location to begin the process again. His ability to remain undetected between crimes suggested he either had significant financial resources or was skilled at living off the grid. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that several of the stolen vehicles used in different cases had been purchased from used car dealerships in the same region of Texas. The dealerships were all within a 50-mile radius of Dallas, suggesting the suspect might have connections to that area. Agent Torres traveled to Texas to investigate the connection personally. Working with local FBI agents, she discovered that all of the vehicles had been purchased using different false identities. But the fake documents had subtle similarities, suggesting they had been created by the same person or organization. More significantly, surveillance footage from the dealerships showed the same man purchasing multiple vehicles over a 2-year period. The images were clear enough to confirm that it was indeed the same person who had stalked and killed Sarah Martinez. The investigation in Texas revealed that the suspect had been living in the Dallas area under another false identity. Working as a freelance security consultant and photographer, he had rented a small apartment under the name James Parker, paying his rent in cash and avoiding any activities that would require background checks or official documentation. When FBI agents raided the apartment, they found evidence that confirmed their worst fears about the scope of his crimes. The walls were covered with photographs of elementary schools, teacher parking lots, and residential areas. Files contained detailed information about dozens of teachers across multiple states, including their home addresses, daily routines, and personal information gathered from social media. Most horrifying of all, investigators found a collection of personal items that appeared to be trophies from his victims: jewelry, clothing, and identification cards from at least 15 different women. Among these items was Sarah's grandmother's wedding ring, which she had always worn and which had been missing from her body when it was found. The apartment had been abandoned recently, with evidence suggesting the suspect had left in a hurry. When news of Sarah's body being discovered had been reported on national television, he had taken most of his important documents and equipment. But he had left behind enough evidence to confirm that Sarah Martinez was just one victim in a killing spree that had lasted for years. As investigators processed the apartment and began the massive task of identifying all of his potential victims, one terrible reality became clear. They were dealing with one of the most prolific serial killers in recent history, and he was still out there, probably already selecting his next victim. The manhunt for Sarah's killer became one of the largest multi-state investigations in recent history. FBI agents, state police, and local law enforcement agencies across the country worked together to track down the man who had terrorized communities. For years, while hiding in plain sight, Agent Rebecca Torres coordinated the search from the FBI's Dallas field office, using the evidence found in the abandoned apartment to piece together the suspect's movements and patterns. The photographs and files revealed a methodical killer who had been documenting his crimes and planning future attacks with disturbing precision. DNA evidence from the apartment was run through national databases, but the suspect had no criminal record under any of his known false identities. However, forensic analysts found something else that provided a crucial lead: fingerprints on several documents that matched prints found at 3 different crime scenes in other states. The breakthrough came when those fingerprints were matched to a military service record. The suspect's real name was revealed to be Michael David Thornton, a former Army intelligence specialist who had been discharged from service 8 years earlier after a psychological evaluation determined he was unfit for duty. Thornton's military record painted a picture of a man whose behavior had become increasingly erratic during his final years of service. He had been reprimanded multiple times for inappropriate conduct toward female colleagues and had been caught photographing military family housing areas without authorization. His discharge papers indicated concerns about his mental stability and potential danger to others. After leaving the military, Thornton had disappeared into civilian life, using his intelligence training to create new identities and avoid detection. His military skills in surveillance, document forgery, and operational planning had served him well in his criminal career. The investigation revealed that Thornton had been living a nomadic lifestyle, moving from state to state in a pattern that corresponded with the disappearances of female teachers. He would establish a temporary base of operations in each area, rent apartments or houses under false names, and spend months studying potential victims before selecting one and executing his plan. His method was always the same: extensive surveillance and research, followed by psychological manipulation to lure his victims away from their homes. The phone calls he made to Sarah and other targets were part of his preparation, now testing their responses and gradually conditioning them to the sound of his voice. On the night he took Sarah, investigators believe Thornton had called her house, and claimed there was an emergency involving one of her students. Using information he had gathered about her teaching schedule and the names of children in her class, he had created a believable story that would compel a caring teacher to leave her home at midnight. He knew exactly what would make her open. That door, Detective Sullivan explained to Sarah's parents during one of his final briefings with the family. He knew she cared deeply about her students, and he used that compassion against her. She thought she was helping a child in need. Search for Thornton intensified when investigators realized he had likely fled to Mexico immediately after abandoning his Dallas apartment. Border surveillance footage showed a man matching his description crossing into Mexico at a remote checkpoint in Texas on the same day. Sarah's body had been discovered. Working with international law enforcement agencies, the FBI tracked Thornton's movements through Mexico and into Central America. He'd been using yet another false identity, traveling as a photographer, documenting rural communities and schools. Even while fleeing, he had been unable to resist his compulsions, taking photographs of teachers and children in several Mexican towns. The final confrontation came 6 weeks after Sarah's body was found. In a small town in Guatemala, where Thornton had been staying at a local hotel, acting on a tip from a hotel employee who had seen his photograph on an international wanted poster, Guatemalan police surrounded the building where he was hiding. Thornton did not go quietly. When police entered his room, they found him attempting to destroy a laptop computer that contained thousands of photographs and detailed files about potential victims in multiple countries. He had been planning to expand his killing spree internationally, targeting American teachers working abroad. The arrest brought relief to communities across the United States where Thornton had operated. But it also opened painful questions about how he had been able to continue his crimes for so long without being caught. The FBI's investigation revealed systematic failures in information sharing between law enforcement agencies that had allowed him to remain undetected. Detective Sullivan traveled to Guatemala to escort Thornton back to the United States, where he would face murder charges in multiple states. During the long flight home, Sullivan found himself sitting just a few rows away from the man who had destroyed so many lives and torn apart so many families. I kept thinking about Sarah, about how scared she must have been in her final hours, Sullivan later told his partner, Detective Park. I kept thinking about her parents, her students, all the people whose lives were changed forever because this monster was allowed to roam free for so long. Thornton's trial began 8 months later in federal court, where he faced charges related to 15 murders across 6 states. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA, fingerprints, photographs, personal items from his victims, and detailed journals describing his crimes. Sarah's parents attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row and listening to testimony about their daughter's final hours. Carmen Martinez later said that seeing Thornton in person had been both terrifying and somehow necessary for her healing process. I needed to look at the man who took my daughter away from us, she explained to reporters outside the courthouse. I needed to see that he was just a man, not a monster, not some unstoppable force. It's just a sick, evil man who made choices that destroyed lives. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting evidence of Thornton's systematic targeting and murder of young teachers across the country. Defense attorneys attempted to argue that he was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions, but the evidence of his careful planning and deliberate deception undermined any claims of insanity. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, Thornton was sentenced to death for the murders he had committed in states with capital punishment, and to life in prison without parole for the others. In the years following Thornton's conviction, Sarah Martinez's case became a catalyst for changes in how law enforcement agencies share information about serial crimes. The FBI established new protocols for identifying patterns across jurisdictions and coordinating multi-state investigations. Sarah's school established a memorial scholarship in her name, awarded annually to students pursuing careers in elementary education. Her classroom was preserved as she had left it, with her students' artwork still displayed on the walls and her lesson plans still written on the whiteboard. The Martinez family channeled their grief into advocacy work, speaking at conferences, and training sessions for law enforcement officers about the importance of taking missing person cases seriously from the very beginning. They also worked with school districts to improve safety protocols and help teachers recognize potential warning signs of dangerous behavior. Sarah would want her death to mean something, Carmen Martinez said during a speech at a national conference on school safety. She would want other teachers to be protected, other families to be spared the pain we've endured. If sharing our story can save even one life, then maybe some good can come from this terrible tragedy. 5 years after Sarah disappeared from her front porch at midnight, her case remains a reminder of both human evil and human resilience. Her killer is locked away forever, unable to hurt anyone else. Her family, while forever changed by their loss, has found ways to honor her memory and help others. And in Millbrook, in the elementary school where Sarah taught with such passion and dedication, her influence lives on in the lives she touched during her brief but meaningful career. Her students, now older, still remember the teacher who made learning fun, who cared about each of them individually, and who died trying to help a child she thought was in need. Sarah Martinez opened her door at midnight and was never seen alive again. But her legacy of kindness, dedication, and love continues to touch lives and inspire others. To make the world a safer place for the children and teachers who carry on her work, the case file may be closed. But Sarah's story serves as both a warning about the predators who walk among us and a testament to the enduring power of love, family, and community in the face of unthinkable tragedy.